The chamber doors sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath, and I knew before I sat down that today would not be an ordinary session. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I was the youngest attaché ever assigned to the Galactic Council on behalf of Earth, which meant I was the one who got sent into rooms nobody else wanted to enter. Ambassador Langley had a fever that morning, or so he claimed, and I suspected he simply did not want to sit through another round of veiled threats from delegates who considered humanity a footnote in a much older story. I did not have that luxury. I walked into the amphitheater alone, past rows of alien dignitaries whose eyes tracked me the way predators track something small and unfamiliar, and I took my seat at the human delegation table, which was, as always, positioned near the back, close to the exit, as if the council expected us to need a quick way out. The air in that chamber was recycled 100 times before it reached my lungs, filtered through systems built by species who had been traveling between stars since before humans learned to write. I had grown used to the smell of it, faintly metallic, faintly sweet. Nothing like the air back home. I had grown used to a lot of things in the 3 years since Earth first made contact with the wider galaxy. I had grown used to being stared at. I had grown used to translators mispronouncing human names on purpose, as a small cruelty dressed up as a technical limitation. I had grown used to swallowing insults so smoothly that most days I barely noticed the taste anymore. That morning, though, something in the room felt different before a single word was spoken. The delegate from the Vantrell Assembly, a species built like walking columns of dark stone, kept glancing toward our table, with an expression I had learned to recognize as amusement. The council speaker, an ancient being from a race so old they had outlived 3 separate governments of their own, called the session to order with the same bored formality as always. I opened my datapad, ready to record the routine business of trade quotas and border disputes that made up most of our days here, and I told myself that whatever was coming, I would handle it the way I always did, quietly, patiently, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not know yet that patience was about to run out, not because I chose to abandon it, but because somewhere far beyond that chamber, a decision had already been made without me, by people who had been waiting far longer than I had, for exactly this kind of morning. The session began the way it always did, with the speaker reciting a list of agenda items in a flat, echoing voice that seemed to come from everywhere in the chamber at once. I sat with my hands folded on the table, watching the holographic displays flicker above each delegation, showing flags and insignias of 100 different worlds. Ours was small compared to the rest, a simple blue and green sphere, no crest, no ancient symbol, just a picture of the planet itself, because when humanity joined this stage, we had nothing else to offer as a banner. I used to think that made us look plain next to the others. Now I understand it made us look exactly like what we were, which was new and untested, and watched very closely by everyone in that room. 3 years is not a long time to learn the unwritten rules of an entire galaxy, but I had spent every one of those years trying. I had studied the way the Vantrell measured respect in silence. The longer a delegate stayed quiet before answering, the more power they were assumed to hold. I had studied the way the Ophiran Concord treated any species without a unified planetary government as unworthy of full voting rights, which was why Earth, still politically divided in 100 small ways despite our shared presence here, sat in the observer section, rather than among the recognized powers. I had studied the way certain species used softly worded suggestions to disguise threats, so that by the time you realized you had been cornered, you had already agreed to something you never meant to agree to. I learned all of this the hard way, in meeting after meeting, watching more experienced diplomats from other worlds outmaneuver our delegation, simply because they understood a game we were only beginning to learn the rules of. I remember my first year here, when Ambassador Langley tried to negotiate a simple trade agreement for rare minerals, only to discover 3 months later that the terms we agreed to gave the other party control over a shipping lane we did not even know we needed. I remember the quiet, humiliating laughter from nearby delegations when the mistake was discovered, laughter that was never loud enough to be called an insult outright, but was never quiet enough to be missed either. We were, in the eyes of most of the council, a curiosity. A species that had somehow stumbled its way into faster-than-light travel a few generations after learning to fly, without the benefit of an older species mentoring us along the way most young civilizations were guided into galactic society. That absence of a mentor made us unpredictable in their eyes, and also, I think, made us easier to underestimate. They assumed our lack of guidance meant a lack of capability. They assumed that because we had not been handed technology, we had simply been lucky enough to stumble upon it. They were wrong about that, though it would take them a very long time to understand exactly how wrong. I spent those years learning who held real power behind the formal titles, which species controlled the trade routes that mattered, which alliances were built on old debts rather than genuine trust, and which delegates could be trusted to keep their word, even when it cost them something. I built a mental map of the entire council, piece by piece, the way you might learn the layout of a house by walking through it in the dark, feeling for walls you cannot see. Every insult I absorbed without response became another data point. Every meeting where we were seated last, spoken to last, acknowledged last, taught me something about where we truly stood, and more importantly, taught me what our leaders back home needed to know before we ever considered stepping further into the light. Because that was the truth, nobody outside a very small circle understood. Earth was not staying quiet because we lacked the strength to speak. We were staying quiet because our leaders had decided, early on, that revealing what we were capable of, before we understood the players on this stage, would be a mistake we could not undo. So while our public delegation sat through insult after insult with practiced calm, another part of our government worked in silence, cataloging weaknesses, mapping alliances, and preparing for the day when staying quiet would no longer be the wisest choice. I did not always agree with that strategy. There were nights, sitting alone in the small quarters assigned to our delegation aboard the council station, when I wondered if patience had become an excuse for cowardice, if we were simply telling ourselves a comforting story to explain why we let so much go unanswered. I remember writing to my sister back on Earth, describing a session where a delegate from the Thren Combine referred to human history as a series of accidents rather than achievements, and how the room had chuckled softly, and how I had smiled along with it, because reacting would have made things worse. My sister wrote back asking why I stayed in a place that treated me that way. I did not have a good answer for her then. I have a better one now, but it came at a cost none of us expected. The morning the insult came, I had no warning that anything unusual was about to happen. The agenda listed a routine review of border security along a contested stretch of space near several newer member worlds, including a small human colony called Aldergrove, established less than 2 years earlier on a moon within a system we had negotiated hard to claim. Aldergrove was not large, perhaps 12,000 people, mostly researchers and their families, living quietly at the edge of territory the council had grudgingly allowed us to settle. It was the kind of colony nobody paid much attention to, tucked into a corner of space that mattered more to us than it did to anyone else in that chamber. The Vantrell delegate rose to speak first, his voice carrying the low resonance that made every word from his species sound like a verdict rather than a statement. He spoke about resource allocation, about the inefficiency of allowing newer species to hold territory they had not proven themselves capable of defending, and then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned Aldergrove by name. He said the colony sat too close to a shipping corridor his people wished to expand, and he suggested, in the same measured tone he might use to discuss cargo tariffs, that the council consider reassigning the territory to a species with, in his words, a demonstrated history worth protecting. I felt the room shift the way you feel, a change in pressure before a storm arrives. It was subtle. Most of the delegates did not react outwardly at all. But I had spent 3 years learning to read the smallest signals in that chamber, and I saw the faint tilt of heads toward our table, the slight pause in conversations at nearby delegations, the sense that everyone wanted to see how the humans would respond to being told, quite plainly, that our people were not worth defending. I sat very still. My instructions, drilled into every member of our delegation, were clear. Do not react. Do not escalate. Record everything. Report everything. And let the decision on how to respond come from people with the authority to make it. I had followed those instructions for 3 years without exception, and I intended to follow them that day as well. But something about the way the Vantrell delegate said the word Aldergrove, casually, like the name of a shipment, rather than a home to 12,000 people, made it difficult to keep my expression neutral. Ambassador Langley's absence that day meant I was the ranking human representative in the chamber, and I understood, even as I sat there, that whatever happened next would be remembered as my response, whether I wanted that responsibility or not. I raised my hand slowly, requesting the floor through the proper channel, and the speaker acknowledged me with the same flat indifference he showed everyone. I stood, feeling every eye in that chamber settle on me, and I chose my words with more care than I had ever chosen words in my life. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse the Vantrell delegate of anything beyond what he had already said aloud. I simply stated, clearly and without emotion, that Aldergrove was a lawfully established colony, recognized under the very treaties this council had drafted, and that any suggestion of reassigning its territory would be treated by our government as a serious matter requiring formal review. It was a careful answer, a diplomat's answer, the kind of answer designed to close a door without slamming it. The Vantrell delegate did not appreciate that I had answered at all. He turned toward our table with the slow, deliberate motion his species used when they wanted to make a point of being unhurried, and he said something I will remember for the rest of my life, something that crossed a line none of us, in 3 years of quiet endurance, had ever seen crossed before. He said that a species without the will to defend its history had no business lecturing others about the value of protecting a home. He said humanity's own past, filled with what he called endless small wars and preventable losses, proved we did not understand sacrifice well enough to speak of it with any authority. And then, almost casually, he mentioned a name. He mentioned the name of a battle from Earth's own history, a battle where many lives had been lost, defending a piece of ground that ultimately fell anyway, and he used it as an example of what he called human futility, human weakness, dressed up as courage. He said it the way someone might mention a footnote in a textbook, without weight, without care, as though the people who died there were nothing more than a convenient example for his argument. The room went silent in a way I had never experienced before in that chamber. It was not the polite, expectant silence that usually followed a sharp exchange. It was something colder. I felt it settle over our table like a physical weight, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in the faces of the other human delegates present, the aides, the junior officers, the handful of military liaisons who rarely spoke in these sessions, that I had never seen before. It was not anger, not exactly. It was recognition. Recognition that something irreversible had just happened, and that no careful diplomatic answer was going to undo it. I did not respond immediately. I could not have, even if my instructions had allowed it, because for a moment, I genuinely did not trust my own voice. I thought of the names carved into memorials back home, names of people who never asked to become symbols, who simply did what they believed needed to be done and paid the price for it. I thought of how easily this delegate had reduced that sacrifice to a debating point in front of an audience who would never understand what it cost, and I felt something settle in my chest that was heavier than anger and steadier than fear. The speaker, sensing the shift in the room, moved quickly to redirect the session, calling for a procedural recess before any further comments could be made. I do not remember walking out of that chamber. I remember standing in the corridor afterward, my hands shaking slightly, staring at the strange architecture of a space station, built by beings who had never once, in all their careful centuries of galactic diplomacy, needed to learn what it felt like to have your grief turned into an argument against you. I sent my report back to Earth within the hour, transcribing the exchange word for word, knowing that whoever read it would understand immediately what had happened, even without my commentary. I did not know, as I sent that message, that somewhere in the depths of our home system, a response had already begun to take shape, one that had been quietly prepared for years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when silence would no longer serve us, and the galaxy would finally learn why we had chosen to stay quiet for so long. For 3 years, our patience had been mistaken for weakness by delegates who measured strength only in the volume of a voice or the size of a fleet paraded for show. They did not understand that a species can watch and study and prepare without ever announcing what it is preparing for. They did not understand that the quietest table in the room is sometimes the one paying the closest attention. I had spent those years believing our silence was a form of caution, a necessary discipline while we learned a galaxy that had learned nothing about us in return. I did not yet understand that it was also something else entirely. It was a countdown, ticking steadily toward a moment none of us in that chamber, myself included, were fully prepared to witness. That night, alone in my quarters, I replayed the delegates' words over and over, not because I wanted to relive the sting of them, but because some instinct told me I needed to remember every detail exactly as it happened. I did not know yet how right that instinct was. I did not know that within days, the quiet corridors of that station would echo with the arrival of something the Council had never prepared for, something that would make every assumption they held about humanity collapse in the space of a single conversation. I only knew, as I finally closed my eyes that night, that whatever came next would not be gentle, and that I had a front row seat to witness it unfold. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay on the narrow bunk in my quarters aboard the Council station, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the faint hum of alien machinery that never quite stopped, and I kept waiting for some signal that the report I had sent would be enough, that someone back home would read it and understand exactly how far things had gone. I did not know what response I expected. Part of me hoped for reassurance, a message telling me the incident would be handled through proper channels, that patience would hold a little longer. Another part of me, a part I was almost ashamed of, hoped for something else entirely. Morning on a space station is a strange concept, since there is no true morning at all, only a scheduled dimming and brightening of artificial light, meant to mimic a day cycle none of us truly needed anymore. I rose when the lights told me to, dressed in the plain gray uniform of our delegation, and made my way to the small communications room reserved for human use. It was little more than a closet compared to the elaborate suites given to older member species, but it was ours, and that morning, it felt like the only honest space on the entire station. A message was waiting for me, flagged with a priority marker I had never seen used before in 3 years of service. It came not from Ambassador Langley, who I assumed was still recovering from whatever illness had kept him away, but from someone higher up the chain, a name I recognized only from briefing documents, Director Ellen Brooks of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. Her message was short. She thanked me for the detailed report, confirmed that it had been forwarded to the highest levels of our government, and instructed me to continue attending sessions exactly as I had before, maintaining a calm and professional presence, giving no indication that anything unusual was expected. She ended the message with a single line that stayed with me for the rest of that day. She wrote that Earth had been waiting a long time to see whether the galaxy would learn to respect us on its own, and that we now had our answer. I read that line 3 times before I understood it was not a comfort. It was a warning, aimed not at me, but at everyone beyond me who would soon come to understand what those words truly meant. Over the following days, I attended sessions as instructed, sitting through routine debates about trade routes and resource quotas, watching delegates from a dozen species argue over matters that, only a week earlier, would have seemed important to me. Now they felt distant, almost irrelevant, like background noise in a room where something far larger was quietly gathering weight. I noticed the Vantrell delegate watching our table more closely than before, as though he expected some retaliation to arrive, in the form of a strongly worded protest or a formal complaint filed through council channels. He did not seem to consider that our silence itself might be the beginning of something he could not anticipate. I want to explain, as clearly as I can, what our government had actually been doing during the 3 years we spent absorbing insult after insult in that chamber, because understanding it changes everything about what happened next. When Earth first made contact with the Galactic Council, our leaders faced an impossible choice. We could reveal everything about our capabilities immediately, hoping that transparency would earn us fair treatment, or we could hold back, learn the political landscape first, and decide later how much to reveal and when. Our leaders chose the second path, not out of fear, but out of a hard lesson learned from our own history, a lesson about what happens to nations that reveal their full strength before understanding the intentions of those around them. While our diplomats sat through years of quiet condescension in the council chamber, our scientists and engineers worked without pause, refining technology that had been developing rapidly since the earliest days of human spaceflight. Humanity had never been handed advanced technology by an older, more experienced species, the way many council members had been guided by mentors when they first reached the stars. We had built everything ourselves, through decades of trial and failure, war and peace, competition and cooperation between nations that did not always trust one another. but somehow managed to unite once the stars became reachable. That difficult path meant our technology developed differently from anything the Council had encountered before. We did not simply copy patterns handed down by a benevolent elder species. We solved problems in our own way, often through brute persistence rather than elegant theory, and the result was a set of capabilities that did not fit neatly into any category the Council understood. Director Brooks, in a longer briefing document I was granted access to after that first message, explained it plainly. She wrote that the Council measured strength by fleet size, visible weaponry, and formal declarations of military doctrine, all things Earth had deliberately kept modest and unremarkable in appearance. What the Council could not measure, because it had no framework for measuring it, was adaptability. Humanity's ships were smaller and less imposing than many Council vessels, but they were built to be reconfigured quickly, upgraded constantly, and operated by crews trained to solve problems no manual had ever anticipated. Our defense systems were not designed around static power projection, the way most Council fleets were, but around rapid response to threats nobody could predict in advance, because our own history had taught us that threats rarely announce themselves politely before arriving. I remember reading that briefing and feeling a strange mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because it meant we had never truly been as weak as the Council assumed. Unease, because it meant we had spent 3 years allowing that assumption to grow, cultivating it deliberately, and I now understood that the insult in the chamber had not simply provoked a reaction. It had triggered the end of a plan that had been in motion long before I ever set foot on that station. 3 days after the incident, I was summoned to a private meeting with Ambassador Langley, who had finally recovered enough to resume his duties. He looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with illness, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a decision you did not make but must still explain to the people affected by it. He closed the door of his office, a small room barely large enough for 2 people and a desk, and told me plainly that the Terran Council of Nations, the unified governing body that represented Earth's interests across all our territories, had reached a decision regarding the events in the chamber. He explained that the decision was not simply about responding to an insult, though the insult had certainly accelerated the timeline. It was about a broader recognition that had been building for months, a recognition that continued silence was beginning to cost us more than it protected us. Other newer member species were watching how the Council treated humanity, and some had begun adjusting their own strategies accordingly, assuming that if humanity would not defend itself, weaker species had even less hope of fair treatment. Our silence, meant originally as caution, had begun to have consequences beyond our own delegation, consequences our leaders were no longer willing to accept. I asked him directly what the decision meant, and he told me something that made the hair on my arms rise, not from fear, but from the sudden, dizzying realization of scale. He said a vessel was already en route to the Council station, a single ship, and that its arrival would mark the end of the quiet phase of our presence among the stars. He would not tell me more than that, citing security protocols that even he was not authorized to override, but he told me to prepare myself, because whatever assumptions the Council held about humanity were about to be tested against reality for the very first time. I left that meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of calm I had not expected. For 3 years, I had wondered whether our patience was wisdom or simply fear dressed up in careful language. Sitting in the narrow corridor outside Ambassador Langley's office, I finally understood that it had been neither. It had been preparation, deliberate and precise, the kind of preparation that only makes sense once you see what it was building toward. The days that followed felt strange in a way I struggled to describe even in my private journal. Sessions in the Council chamber continued as though nothing had changed. Delegates from a dozen species arguing over trade disputes and territorial boundaries with the same tired formality as always. But I noticed small differences now that I knew what was coming. I noticed the Vantrell delegate's confidence beginning to seem slightly performative, as though even he sensed that something had shifted, even if he could not name what it was. I noticed other delegations glancing toward our table more frequently, perhaps sensing the same unfamiliar stillness in our posture that I felt within myself. Word of the incident had spread beyond the chamber itself, as I learned from conversations with junior aides from other delegations who approached me quietly in the station's common areas, careful not to be seen showing too much interest in human affairs. A young attaché from the Mirren Collective, a smaller species who had joined the Council only a decade before humanity, told me privately that several newer member worlds had watched the exchange with the Vantral delegate closely, and that many of them were curious, for the first time, whether humanity might actually respond in a way that mattered. She did not say this with hope exactly, more with the cautious curiosity of someone who had grown used to watching more powerful species act without consequence, wondering if this time would finally be different. I did not know how to answer her honestly, because I did not yet know myself what shape our response would take. I only knew, from the careful, guarded tone in Ambassador Langley's voice during our meeting, that it would not be small, and that it would not be delayed much longer. On the 5th day after the incident, I received a message instructing all human delegation staff to gather in a secure briefing room aboard the station, a space normally reserved for classified communications with Earth. I arrived to find not only our full delegation present, but also several unfamiliar faces in military uniforms, officers I had never seen before, who introduced themselves only by rank and surname, offering no further detail about their assignment. Their presence alone told me more than any briefing document could have. Diplomats did not typically require armed escorts to attend a status update. The senior officer present, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried the flat calm of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news without embellishment, informed us that a vessel identified as the Steadfast, under the command of Captain Edward Cross, had entered the outer boundary of the system housing the Council station and would arrive within hours. She explained that its arrival had not been formally announced to the Council, in keeping with standard human protocol for the movement of our vessels, a protocol other species found unusual, since most Council fleets moved with elaborate ceremony and advance notice, designed to project strength through spectacle. She explained that our approach was different by design. Humanity did not believe strength needed to announce itself before it arrived. She said this without emotion, simply stating it as fact, and I understood, watching her deliver that line, that this was not merely a philosophy adopted for convenience. It was a belief woven into the very structure of how our species had learned to operate, forged through centuries of history where the loudest declarations of power were rarely the ones that mattered most, when true danger finally arrived. I asked her, carefully, what the arrival of a single ship was meant to accomplish, given the scale of the Council's own fleets, and the sheer number of species represented in that chamber. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me ever since. She said that the Council had spent 3 years assuming humanity's silence meant we had nothing worth showing them. She said the Steadfast was not being sent to prove that assumption wrong through force alone, but to make the Council understand, in a single, unmistakable moment, exactly how much they had misunderstood about the species sitting quietly at the back of their chamber. I did not fully grasp what she meant until hours later, when the first reports began arriving from station sensors, tracking an object approaching from beyond the system's outer boundary, moving with a precision and quiet efficiency that immediately drew the attention of every species monitoring the region. I stood in that secure briefing room, watching the tracking display update in real time, and I felt the same cold stillness I had felt in the chamber days earlier, except this time, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, I did not feel like the smallest presence in the room. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something the entire galaxy was about to be forced to understand, whether they were ready for it or not. News of an unidentified vessel entering the system spread through the station faster than any official channel could contain it. By the time I left the briefing room, corridors that were normally quiet during the station's artificial evening hours were filled with delegates and aides from a dozen species, all speaking in hushed, urgent tones, all trying to learn what everyone else already seemed to know. I kept my expression carefully neutral, the way I had trained myself to do over 3 years, even as my thoughts raced ahead to what might happen once that vessel finally arrived. I made my way back toward our delegation's small section of the station, only to find Ambassador Langley waiting for me outside my quarters, his expression grim, in a way I had rarely seen from him. He told me that new information had reached him in the hours since our briefing, information that changed the shape of everything happening around us. The Vantral Assembly, apparently unsettled by the sudden and unexplained movement of a human vessel into the system, had responded not with caution, but with escalation. Sensors monitoring the outer edges of our claimed territory had detected Vantrell patrol ships altering course toward the space surrounding Aldergrove, the very colony their delegate had mentioned by name only days earlier. I felt my stomach tighten at the news. Aldergrove was not a military installation. It was a research colony, home to families who had traveled there hoping to build something new at the edge of human territory. People who had no way to defend themselves against a fleet of any real size. The idea that the Vantrell might use the tension surrounding the Steadfast's arrival as cover for direct action against a defenseless colony was almost too reckless to believe, and yet Ambassador Langley's expression told me he believed it entirely. He explained that our government had anticipated this possibility, though not the exact timing. He said that part of the reasoning behind sending the Steadfast now, rather than waiting for a slower diplomatic escalation, was precisely because our intelligence services had detected early signs that certain factions within the Vantrell military leadership viewed humanity's continued silence as an opportunity, rather than a courtesy. They believed, he said, that a species which absorbed insult without response would likely absorb aggression the same way, and some among them had begun quietly advocating for a more direct demonstration of dominance, one that would remind the newer species of the Council exactly where they stood in the galactic order. I asked him what would happen to Aldergrove if the Steadfast did not arrive in time, and he admitted, with a rare and uncomfortable honesty, that our government had prepared contingencies for that possibility as well, contingencies he was not authorized to describe to me in detail. He told me only that Aldergrove was not as undefended as it appeared to any outside observer, and that the colony's true capacity to protect itself had been deliberately understated, in the same way our fleet's true capabilities had been understated to the Council for the past 3 years. That revelation should have comforted me more than it did. Instead, it left me with a strange, unsettled feeling, a growing awareness that everything I had believed about humanity's position in this galaxy, everything I thought I understood after 3 years of careful observation, was only a fraction of the full picture. I had been trusted with enough information to represent our interests in the chamber, but not enough to fully grasp the scale of what our leaders had been quietly building in the shadows of our public restraint. I spent that night in the observation lounge near the edge of the station, a rarely used space with a long, transparent viewport looking out over the vast dark expanse beyond, dotted with distant stars and the faint glimmer of other vessels moving through the system. I was not alone there for long. A junior officer from the Steadfast's advanced communication team, a young man named Peter Langford who had been assigned temporarily to the station to coordinate with our delegation, joined me at the viewport, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. He did not say much at first, simply standing beside me, watching the same dark expanse I had been watching. Eventually he spoke, quietly, almost to himself, saying that he had grown up hearing stories from his grandparents about a time before Earth had ever left its own solar system, a time when the idea of standing on a station like this, watching for the arrival of a human warship among 100 alien delegations, would have seemed like nothing more than fiction. I asked him if he was nervous about what was coming, and he shook his head slowly, telling me that nervousness was not quite the right word. He said what he felt was closer to relief, the kind of relief that comes after holding something heavy for a very long time, and finally being allowed to set it down. I understood exactly what he meant, because I felt something similar myself, though tangled together with a thread of genuine worry for the people of Aldergrove, whose safety now depended on a chain of decisions made far above either of our positions. We stood together in silence for a while longer, watching the stars, until a soft chime from his communicator drew his attention. He read the message quickly, his expression shifting from calm to something sharper, more alert, and he told me that sensor data confirmed the Vantrell patrol ships had entered the outer boundary of Aldergrove's system, moving in a formation consistent with what military analysts back home classified as an intimidation posture, not yet an attack, but a clear signal of intent. I asked him what that meant for the colony, and he told me, with a steadiness that surprised me, that the Steadfast had already altered its approach vector in response to the same data, no longer heading directly toward the Council station, but redirecting toward Aldergrove instead. He explained that Captain Cross had made the decision independently, without waiting for further authorization from Earth, because the situation demanded an immediate response, rather than a delayed one, filtered through layers of diplomatic approval. I felt a fresh wave of tension at that news, because it meant the confrontation everyone had been quietly preparing for was no longer a distant possibility playing out on some future timeline. It was happening now, in real time, light years away, with the lives of 12,000 people caught directly in the middle of it. I returned to my quarters that night but found it impossible to rest, my mind cycling endlessly through every scenario I could imagine, from peaceful resolution to something far worse. I thought of the families I had read about in briefing documents when Aldergrove was first established, researchers who had chosen to raise their children at the edge of known space because they believed in what humanity was building out there, a belief that had never once required the promise of protection from a distant, uncaring council. They had trusted their own government to keep them safe, and now that trust was being tested in a way none of us had fully anticipated. Morning came, though the word felt increasingly meaningless aboard a station where daylight was simply a setting on an artificial lighting system. I made my way to the secure briefing room as soon as the lights shifted to their scheduled waking cycle, finding it already crowded with delegation staff and military liaisons, all gathered around a central display showing a live feed of sensor data from the Aldergrove system, relayed through a series of communication relays positioned across human territory. The image was difficult to interpret at first, a cluster of markers representing ships, some human, most Vantral, arranged in a tense standoff above the pale curve of Aldergrove's moon. A calm voice, presumably Captain Cross himself, though heavily filtered through layers of secure transmission, could be heard issuing instructions to what sounded like a small defensive fleet stationed near the colony. A fleet whose existence had never been mentioned in any of the Council's assessments of human military capability. I realized, watching that display, that Aldergrove had never truly been undefended at all. It had simply been defended quietly, in a way designed to remain invisible until the moment it was needed. The tension in that briefing room was unlike anything I had experienced in 3 years of diplomatic service. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Every eye remained fixed on the display, as the markers representing Vantral patrol ships shifted position, testing the boundary of the human defensive formation, probing for weakness the way predators circle prey before committing to an attack. I found myself gripping the edge of the table without realizing it, watching numbers and symbols I barely understood, waiting for some sign of what would happen next. And then, almost without warning, a new marker appeared on the display, moving with a speed and precision that made every other symbol on the screen seem sluggish by comparison. It was the Steadfast, arriving not at the Council station as originally expected, but directly into the tense standoff above Aldergrove, appearing on sensor readings as though it had simply chosen the moment of its arrival, with deliberate, almost theatrical precision. I watched the Vantral formation hesitate, their markers slowing, spreading slightly apart in a way that even I, with my limited understanding of tactical displays, recognized as uncertainty. Whatever confidence had driven their patrol ships to test the boundary of Aldergrove's defenses moments earlier seemed to falter the instant the Steadfast's presence registered on their own sensors, and I understood, watching that subtle shift play out across the display, that something fundamental had just changed in the balance of power above that quiet, unremarkable little moon. I did not know yet exactly what had happened aboard the Steadfast in those first moments of arrival, what words Captain Cross exchanged with the Vantral commander, what silent calculations shifted in the minds of officers on both sides, as they weighed the risk of continuing a confrontation neither had fully expected. I only knew, watching the tension in that briefing room begin to ease into something closer to cautious relief, that the quiet phase of humanity's presence among the stars had truly come to an end, and that whatever followed would be remembered, by every species watching, as the moment everything changed. The standoff above Aldergrove did not end in violence, though for nearly an hour the outcome remained impossible to predict. I learned the details later, pieced together from mission reports, and a private conversation with Peter Langford, who had access to the full transcript of communications between Captain Cross and the Vantral patrol commander. According to that record, Captain Cross did not issue threats or demands when the Steadfast arrived above the colony. He simply opened a direct channel to the Vantral formation and stated, calmly, that any further movement toward Aldergrove's surface would be treated as an act requiring an immediate response, and that the Steadfast was prepared to provide that response without delay or hesitation. What struck me most, reading that transcript afterward, was how little Captain Cross actually said. There was no lengthy explanation of consequences, no dramatic recitation of what humanity was capable of, none of the posturing I had come to expect from powerful species during my years in the council chamber. He made a single clear statement and then waited, allowing the silence that followed to carry whatever weight it needed to carry. The Vantral commander, according to the same transcript, requested clarification on the nature of the response being threatened, and Captain Cross replied only that clarification would not be necessary if the patrol ships withdrew immediately. They withdrew within minutes. I do not know exactly what calculation ran through the mind of that Vantral commander in the moments before making that decision, but I suspect it had less to do with any specific detail about the Steadfast's capabilities and more to do with the simple, unsettling fact that a single human vessel had arrived precisely where it needed to be, at precisely the moment it needed to arrive, without any prior warning reaching Vantral intelligence networks that should have detected its approach long before it entered the system. That kind of precision, appearing without explanation, was more unsettling to a species accustomed to measuring threats through visible fleet numbers than any show of force could have been. Once the Vantral patrol withdrew, the Steadfast remained above Aldergrove for several hours, long enough to confirm the colony's safety and coordinate with the small defensive fleet already stationed there, a fleet whose existence I was only now beginning to fully understand, had been carefully concealed from Council awareness since the colony's founding. It was during those hours that Captain Cross made the decision that would ultimately bring the confrontation back to where it had begun, aboard the Council station itself, in the very chamber where the insult that started everything had first been spoken aloud. I received word of the Steadfast's new course early the following morning, another message flagged with priority markers, this time informing our delegation that the vessel would arrive at the Council station within hours, and that Captain Cross had formally requested to address the full Council in an emergency session. Ambassador Langley, still recovering from the exhaustion of the previous days, gathered our delegation together to explain what little he knew about the captain's intentions, which was not much beyond the basic framework of the request itself. He told us that the request had already been granted, somewhat reluctantly, by the Council speaker, who apparently understood that refusing a formal address from a vessel capable of resolving a tense standoff without a single shot fired would raise more uncomfortable questions than allowing the address to proceed. He told us to prepare ourselves for a session unlike any we had attended before, though even he, with his years of experience navigating council politics, seemed uncertain exactly what to expect. I spent the hours before the Steadfast's arrival trying to steady myself, running through every possible scenario in my mind, wondering whether Captain Cross intended a formal protest, a declaration of policy, or something else entirely. I thought back to the words Director Brooks had written in her earlier message, that Earth had been waiting a long time to see whether the galaxy would learn to respect us on its own, and that we now had our answer. I understood now, with growing clarity, that whatever answer we had given would soon be delivered directly to the Council, not through careful diplomatic language, filtered through delegates like myself, but through the presence of a warship and the voice of the man who commanded it. Word of the Steadfast's approach to the station spread even faster than it had before its arrival at Aldergrove, and by the time I made my way toward the main observation deck near the docking bays, a crowd of delegates and aides from a dozen species had already gathered, drawn by curiosity, unease, or some combination of both. I found myself standing near the Mirren attaché who had spoken to me privately days earlier, and she gave me a small, uncertain nod as I approached, her expression caught somewhere between hope and apprehension. The Steadfast appeared on the station's external view screens without fanfare, no elaborate formation of escort vessels, no dramatic display of weaponry meant to intimidate onlookers. It was, by the standards of most council fleets, a modest vessel, sleek and efficient in design, built for speed and adaptability rather than sheer size. And yet something about the way it moved through the docking approach, precise and unhurried, carried a quiet weight that made the crowd around me fall silent as it drew closer. I had spent 3 years watching powerful species parade their fleets through ceremonial displays meant to overwhelm observers with scale, and I realized, watching the Steadfast approach, that humanity had chosen an entirely different kind of statement, one built not on spectacle, but on the simple, undeniable fact of its presence, exactly where it needed to be. The docking sequence completed without incident, and within minutes, Word spread through the crowd that Captain Cross himself would proceed directly to the council chamber to deliver his address, accompanied by only a small honor guard, rather than the large military escort many had expected. I made my way toward the chamber alongside the rest of our delegation, my heart pounding with an anticipation I had not felt since my very first day aboard this station 3 years earlier. The chamber, when I entered it, felt different from every session I had attended before. Every seat was filled, delegates from species who rarely bothered attending routine sessions now present in full, drawn by the rare spectacle of a formal address from a species most of them still barely understood. The Vantrell delegation sat near the center of the chamber, their usual confident posture noticeably subdued, whispered conversations passing between them in low, urgent tones. I took my seat at our delegation's table, feeling the weight of every eye in that chamber shift toward us, the same way they had shifted the day the insult was first spoken. Except this time, the attention carried a different quality entirely, something closer to genuine curiosity than casual dismissal. The speaker called the emergency session to order with none of the bored formality he usually carried, his ancient voice steadier and more deliberate than I had ever heard it. He announced the arrival of Captain Edward Cross of the vessel Steadfast, representing the Terran Council of Nations, and invited him to address the assembled council. The chamber doors opened, and Captain Cross entered alone, walking with a measured, unhurried pace toward the central speaking platform, his uniform simple and unadorned, compared to the elaborate ceremonial dress worn by most council military officials during formal addresses. He was not a tall man, nor an especially imposing one in appearance, and yet the chamber fell completely silent as he crossed the floor, the kind of silence I had only ever heard once before, in the moments following the Vantrell delegate's insult days earlier. He reached the speaking platform and stood there for a moment without speaking, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled delegations, pausing briefly, almost imperceptibly, on the Vantrell table before continuing its sweep across the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the anger I had half expected, none of the theatrical weight that other species often brought to moments meant to project dominance. He spoke plainly, almost conversationally, and yet every word landed in that silent chamber with the force of something far heavier than volume alone could have carried. He began by acknowledging the incident that had occurred days earlier, referencing the words spoken about Aldergrove, and about the memory of human lives lost in a battle from our own history, without repeating the specifics of the insult itself. He said that humanity had spent 3 years listening carefully to how this council conducted itself, not because we lacked the ability to respond sooner, but because we understood, from our own difficult history, the value of fully understanding those around you before deciding how to engage with them. He said that patience, in our experience, was not the absence of strength, but often the clearest evidence of it, since only those secure in their own capability could afford to wait, watch, and learn, without feeling the need to prove themselves at every turn. He paused there, letting that statement settle over the chamber, and I watched several delegations shift almost imperceptibly in their seats, the weight of his words clearly landing differently across the room, depending on how each species had chosen to treat humanity during those same 3 years. He continued, saying that the events of the past several days, culminating in an unprovoked escalation near a defenseless human colony, had made clear that patience alone was no longer sufficient to ensure the safety of our people or the respect owed to them. He said that humanity had not come to this chamber seeking conflict, and that nothing about the Steadfast's arrival at Aldergrove or at this station was intended as a declaration of hostility toward the council as a whole. But he said, and here his voice shifted slightly, gaining an edge of quiet finality that made the hair on my arms rise, that the galaxy had spent 3 years operating under a set of assumptions about humanity that were no longer going to be allowed to stand unchallenged. He said those assumptions had led, directly and inexcusably, to a moment where a respected delegate felt comfortable using the deaths of human beings as a rhetorical device in a debate about territorial expansion, and that such a moment would never be permitted to occur again without consequence. The chamber remained utterly silent as he spoke, and I realized, watching the faces around me, that every delegation present understood exactly what was happening. This was not simply a protest, nor a formal complaint filed through diplomatic channels. It was the moment humanity had chosen to step fully into the light after 3 years of careful shadow, and every species in that chamber was about to learn precisely what that meant. Captain Cross raised a hand, and the large display behind the speaking platform, normally reserved for procedural charts and trade statistics, shifted to show a new image, one that made the chamber's silence deepen even further. It was a simple star map, showing human territory not as the small, modest cluster of systems the Council had always assumed, but as a network extending far beyond what any official Council record had ever documented. I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the Vantrell table, and I understood immediately that this map alone was already rewriting everything the Council believed it understood about the scale of human presence among the stars. Captain Cross explained, in the same calm and measured tone he had used throughout his address, that Earth's public presence within Council territory represented only a portion of our actual reach. He said that humanity had, from the earliest days of our contact with this Council, maintained a policy of measured disclosure, revealing only what was necessary to participate in Council affairs, while continuing to develop and expand our capabilities beyond what any outside observer could easily track. He said this was not deception in the sense of active dishonesty, since nothing shown to the Council had ever been false, but it was, he admitted plainly, a deliberate strategy of restraint, chosen because our own history had taught us the danger of revealing full strength before understanding the true intentions of those around us. He described, briefly and without excessive detail, the origins of that caution. He spoke of Earth's own turbulent history, centuries marked by conflict between nations that eventually learned, through immense cost, the value of careful diplomacy paired with quiet strength. He said that when humanity first achieved faster-than-light travel, our leaders faced the same choice every newly discovered species faced upon joining this Council, whether to trust immediately in the goodwill of an unfamiliar galactic community, or to proceed with the same careful caution that had eventually allowed our own fractured nations to find lasting peace among themselves. He said our leaders chose caution, not because we expected malice from every species we encountered, but because history had taught us that trust extended too quickly, without understanding, often led to exploitation rather than partnership. The display behind him shifted again, this time showing images of technology I did not fully understand, systems described in terms unfamiliar even to me despite years of exposure to Council briefings. Captain Cross explained, in broad terms accessible even to those without a technical background, that human engineering had developed along a different path than most Council species, shaped by necessity rather than inherited wisdom from an older mentor civilization. He said that where many Council fleets prioritized visible scale and static power, designed to project dominance through appearance, human engineering had prioritized adaptability, resilience, and rapid response. Qualities that were far harder to measure from the outside, but proved, time and again throughout our own turbulent history, to matter more in moments of genuine crisis than sheer size ever could. He did not claim humanity possessed technology superior to every species in that chamber across every category, and I noted, with some relief, that his tone remained free of the boastful exaggeration I had heard from other delegations during less consequential debates. He simply stated facts, allowing the weight of those facts to speak for themselves. He explained that the defensive network quietly established around colonies like Aldergrove had been designed specifically to respond to exactly the kind of escalation the Vantrell Patrol had attempted days earlier, and that similar networks, invisible to standard Council sensor sweeps, protected every major human settlement across our territory, a fact that had never once been disclosed in any official report submitted to this Council. I watched the reactions ripple across the chamber as he spoke, delegates from a dozen species exchanging glances, some clearly troubled by the implications of what they were hearing, others watching with an expression closer to grudging respect. The speaker, ancient and normally unreadable, sat with an unusually still posture, his attention fixed entirely on Captain Cross as though recalculating, in real time, decades of assumptions built up around humanity's place within this Council. Captain Cross continued, addressing directly the assumption that had clearly shaped so much of the Council's treatment of our species over the past 3 years. The assumption that humanity's quiet, restrained presence in Council affairs reflected a lack of capability, rather than a deliberate choice. He said that assumption had cost the council very little until now, since our own restraint had absorbed the consequences of that misunderstanding without complaint. But he said, and here his voice carried a weight I felt settle over the entire chamber like a physical presence, that the events of recent days had made clear the true cost of allowing that assumption to persist unchallenged. He said a respected delegate had felt comfortable enough in that assumption to publicly diminish the memory of human lives lost in service to something greater than themselves, and a military faction within a powerful council species had felt comfortable enough in that same assumption to test the safety of a defenseless colony, confident that no meaningful consequence would follow. He said, plainly and without embellishment, that both assumptions had now been proven wrong, and that the council would need to recalibrate its understanding of humanity accordingly, not through further demonstration of force, which he made clear humanity had no desire to provide, unless directly provoked again, but through a genuine reassessment of the respect owed to any species within this chamber, regardless of how long they had participated in council affairs, or how quietly they had chosen to conduct themselves during that time. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the kind of silence that follows a truth too significant to respond to immediately. I glanced toward the Vantrell table and saw their senior delegate, the same one who had spoken the insult that started everything, sitting with a rigid posture that betrayed none of the confident amusement he had carried during that earlier session. Beside me, Ambassador Langley remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, though I noticed his hands, resting on the table before him, had finally stopped their faint, nervous tapping, the first time I had seen them fully at rest since the incident began. The speaker finally broke the silence, his ancient voice carrying a note of genuine uncertainty I had never heard from him before in 3 years of sessions. He asked Captain Cross directly what humanity intended to do with the knowledge now revealed to the full council, whether this address represented a formal ultimatum, a declaration of new policy, or something else entirely. Captain Cross answered without hesitation, saying that humanity sought no special privilege beyond the basic respect owed to any species participating honestly in this council's affairs. He said we did not seek dominance over other member worlds, nor did we intend to use the capabilities revealed today as a tool for coercion or intimidation in future dealings. He said the purpose of this address was simple, to ensure that no species within this chamber would ever again mistake human restraint for human weakness, and to make clear that any future actions taken against human territory or human lives would be met with a response proportional to the seriousness of that action, delivered without the extended delay that patience had required of us until now. It was, I realized as he spoke, both a warning and an offer, delivered with a precision that left no ambiguity about which path the council would be wise to choose going forward. I watched delegates across the chamber begin to understand the same thing, the subtle shift in posture, the exchanged glances between species who had spent years treating humanity as a curiosity, rather than a genuine participant in galactic affairs, all of them now recalculating, in real time, exactly how much that treatment needed to change. The Vantrell delegate rose to speak once Captain Cross had finished, and I felt the entire chamber lean forward slightly, waiting to see whether he would attempt the same tone of dismissive confidence he had carried days earlier, or whether the events since then had changed his approach entirely. He began carefully, choosing his words with none of the casual weight he had used when mentioning Aldergrove and the memory of human lives lost in battle. He acknowledged that the actions of the patrol ships near Aldergrove had exceeded the authorization granted by his government, describing them as the actions of an overzealous regional commander rather than official Vantrell policy. I watched Captain Cross listen to this explanation, without visible reaction. His expression neither hostile nor accepting, simply attentive, the way someone listens when they are gathering information, rather than preparing a rebuttal. When the Vantrell delegate finished, Captain Cross asked a single question, delivered with the same calm precision that had marked his entire address. He asked whether the regional commander responsible for ordering the patrol toward Aldergrove had acted entirely without knowledge or tacit approval from anyone within the Vantrell military hierarchy, or whether that commander's actions reflected a broader sentiment quietly shared among certain factions within their leadership. The chamber fell silent again, and I saw the Vantrell delegate hesitate for the first time since I had known him, a hesitation that told me more clearly than any answer could have that Captain Cross's question had struck closer to the truth than the delegate wished to admit. He eventually answered that an internal review would be conducted, promising cooperation with any council inquiry into the matter. Though the vagueness of his response left little doubt in my mind, or apparently in the minds of many delegates around the chamber, that the sentiment behind that patrol's actions ran deeper than a single commander acting alone. The speaker, sensing the delicate balance of the moment, intervened to propose a formal council review of the incident, separate from any bilateral discussion between Earth and the Vantrell Assembly. A review that would examine both the conduct of the patrol near Aldergrove and the earlier remarks made in this very chamber regarding human history and human sacrifice. Several delegations voiced immediate support for this proposal, including, notably, representatives from smaller member species who had rarely spoken up in defense of humanity during the years I had attended these sessions. I recognized the Mirren attaché among them, her voice steady, as she stated that the treatment of newer member species by more established powers had long been a quiet concern among smaller worlds, one that had simply lacked the standing to be voiced effectively until now. I understood, watching this unfold, that the consequences facing the Vantrell Assembly would not come primarily through any punishment imposed directly by humanity, but through the broader shift now taking place across the entire Council, as other species reassessed their own relationships with a power structure that had, for generations, rewarded aggressive dismissiveness toward newer members. The formal review proposed by the speaker passed with a wider margin of support than I had expected, a clear signal that the Vantrell Assembly's standing within the Council had already begun to erode in the hours since Captain Cross's address began. Over the following weeks, I watched that erosion continue steadily. The formal review confirmed what many had already suspected, that the patrol action near Aldergrove had indeed been quietly encouraged by senior military officials within the Vantrell government, officials who believed, based on years of observing humanity's restrained conduct in council affairs, that a demonstration of aggression would go unanswered and would reinforce their own influence over contested territory near newer member worlds. Those officials faced consequences within their own government once the review's findings became public, consequences I was not fully privy to, since Vantrell internal politics remained largely opaque to outside observers. But the shift in their delegation's posture within the council chamber told its own story clearly enough. The delegate who had spoken the original insult did not return to his seat after the third session, following Captain Cross's address. I never learned the full details of what led to his replacement, whether it came through internal political pressure or a broader restructuring within his government's diplomatic corps. But his absence from the chamber marked a quiet, undeniable end to the confident dismissiveness that had defined the Vantrell Assembly's treatment of humanity for as long as I had served in this role. What struck me most, during those weeks of reassessment across the Council, was not the punishment faced by the Vantrell Assembly specifically, but the broader shift in how every delegation began treating our table. Species who had barely acknowledged our presence during 3 years of sessions now sought out conversations with Ambassador Langley, requesting private meetings to discuss trade agreements and diplomatic cooperation with a seriousness that had never existed before. The seating arrangement in the chamber itself changed within a month. Our delegation moved from the far back corner near the exit to a position closer to the center of the room, a small adjustment that carried enormous symbolic weight within a council obsessed with hierarchy and visible status. I found myself, during those weeks, reflecting often on the years of quiet endurance that had led to this moment, wondering whether the cost of that patience had truly been worth what we gained from it. I raised this question once with Director Brooks, during a brief visit she made to the station shortly after the formal review concluded. She considered my question carefully before answering, telling me that the value of those 3 years was not simply in what we had learned about the Council during that time, though that knowledge had certainly proven useful. The greater value, she said, was in what those years had taught the rest of the galaxy about the difference between weakness and restraint, a lesson that could never have been taught through any speech or demonstration, delivered without the weight of genuine, sustained patience behind it. She explained that had humanity revealed our full capabilities immediately upon joining the Council, the reaction from other species would likely have been fear rather than respect, a fear that often curdles into preemptive hostility among species who feel threatened by an unknown power appearing suddenly in their midst. By allowing the Council to underestimate us for 3 years, We had given every species time to form their own honest opinions about humanity, unclouded by the anxiety that raw power often inspires. When the truth finally emerged, it emerged alongside 3 years of evidence that humanity, despite everything we could have revealed, had chosen restraint, diplomacy, and genuine engagement with council affairs, rather than intimidation. That evidence, she said, mattered more in the long run than any single demonstration of strength ever could have on its own. I thought about her words often in the months that followed, watching the slow, steady transformation of our delegation's standing within the council. The formal review into the Vantrell Assembly's conduct led to broader reforms within council protocol, new provisions requiring greater protection for newer member species against unilateral military action by more established powers, provisions that several smaller delegations credited directly to the precedent set by humanity's response to the Aldergrove incident. I watched species who had once dismissed our history as a curiosity begin requesting formal briefings on human diplomatic practices, curious about the philosophy that had allowed a species without an older mentor civilization to navigate first contact with such careful, deliberate patience. The Vantrell Assembly itself did not disappear from the council, nor did their influence vanish overnight, but the confident dismissiveness that had once characterized their approach to newer species softened considerably in the months following the incident, replaced by a more careful, measured engagement that suggested even their leadership understood the cost of underestimating a species, simply because that species chose silence over spectacle. I do not know whether that shift reflected genuine change in their values, or simply pragmatic recalculation in response to consequence, but either outcome served the broader goal our government had pursued from the very beginning, a galaxy that would no longer treat humanity, or by extension any newer species, as inherently unworthy of respect. I remained aboard the council station through all of these developments, watching the slow transformation of a political landscape I had spent 3 years learning to navigate under very different circumstances. The work did not become easier exactly. The endless complexity of council politics ensured that no diplomatic assignment would ever be simple, but it became, for the first time since I had arrived, work conducted on genuinely equal footing, a distinction that changed everything about how I approached each session from that point forward. A year passed before I finally understood the full shape of what had changed, not just for our delegation, but for humanity's place among the stars entirely. I had been offered a promotion within the Terran Diplomatic Corps not long after the Aldergrove incident, a position that would have taken me back to Earth to help train the next generation of attachés preparing for assignment across an expanding network of human diplomatic postings. I declined it, at least for the time being, choosing instead to remain aboard the council station, partly because the work there had finally become meaningful in a way it never had before, and partly because I wanted to witness, firsthand, how far this transformation would continue to unfold. Aldergrove had grown in that year, its population nearly doubling as new settlers arrived, drawn by the quiet confidence that came from knowing their colony now sat under the protection of a defensive network the entire galaxy understood to be real, rather than a promise nobody outside our government had ever taken seriously. I visited the colony once, during a brief diplomatic tour, arranged to showcase human settlements to a delegation of curious Mirran officials interested in establishing closer trade relations with our government. Walking through Aldergrove's modest streets, past research facilities, and small homes built from materials shipped across enormous distances, I felt something I had not expected to feel after everything that happened, a quiet, steady pride in what our patience had ultimately protected. The Vantrell Assembly continued its slow process of internal reform throughout that year, their government replacing several senior military officials implicated in the review following the Aldergrove incident, and their delegation's conduct within council sessions grew noticeably more measured, though I never mistook that change for genuine warmth toward humanity. Respect earned through consequence is rarely the same as respect earned through affection, and I understood that our relationship with the Vantrell Assembly would likely remain cautious and formal for a long time to come, perhaps permanently. That outcome did not trouble me the way it once might have. I had learned, over 4 years of service in that chamber, that not every relationship needed to be warm to be functional, and that mutual respect, even when born from hard consequence, was often a sturdier foundation than friendship built on convenience alone. What surprised me most, during that year of gradual transformation, was watching how other, newer member species began adjusting their own approach to council affairs in response to what humanity had demonstrated. The Mirren Collective, emboldened by the precedent set in the formal review, began pushing for greater representation in council decision-making processes that had long excluded smaller worlds from meaningful participation. Other newer species followed their lead, forming loose alliances aimed at ensuring that the protections established in the aftermath of the Aldergrove incident would extend broadly, rather than remaining a special exception carved out solely for humanity's benefit. I found myself, during quiet moments aboard the station, thinking often about that first session I attended nearly 4 years earlier, nervous and uncertain, watching alien delegates study our small blue and green flag with expressions I struggled to interpret. I thought about every small humiliation absorbed during those early years, every mispronounced name, every dismissive glance, every meeting where our delegation sat last, spoke last, mattered least in the eyes of a council that measured worth through volume and spectacle rather than substance. I understood now, in a way I could not have understood then, that every one of those moments had been building towards something, a foundation of patient observation that ultimately allowed humanity to enter this galaxy's true political landscape on our own terms, rather than terms dictated by species who assumed our silence meant we had nothing worth protecting. Captain Cross remained in this region of space for several months following his address, the steadfast serving as a visible, steady reminder of humanity's renewed presence within council affairs, though he never again needed to deliver a formal address of that magnitude. I met him only once during that time, at a small reception held aboard the station to mark the formal signing of new trade agreements between Earth and several previously distant member species. He was quieter in person than I expected, given the weight his words had carried in that chamber, speaking with the same measured calm he had shown throughout the entire crisis, entirely without the pride or self-satisfaction I might have expected from someone who had so thoroughly reshaped the Council's understanding of our species. I asked him once, during that brief conversation, whether he had known, standing on that speaking platform, exactly how significant his address would prove to be. He considered the question for a long moment before answering, telling me that he had understood the stakes clearly enough, but that the true significance of any single moment was rarely visible from within it. He said the real work, the years of quiet study and careful restraint that made that address possible, had been carried out by countless people across our government, whose names would never be remembered the way his was. Diplomats like myself, sitting through years of small humiliations, engineers developing technology without recognition, colonists building homes in uncertain corners of space, simply because they believed in what humanity was capable of becoming. He said the address in that chamber was simply the moment all of that quiet work finally became visible, and that visibility, however dramatic it appeared from the outside, was never the true achievement. The achievement had been built slowly, patiently, over years nobody outside a small circle had ever fully appreciated until the moment demanded it. I think about that conversation often, especially now, sitting once again in the observation lounge near the edge of the station, the same place where I once stood with Peter Langford watching the dark expanse beyond, waiting for news that would change everything. The stars looked the same as they did that night, distant and quiet, indifferent to the shifting fortunes of the species who study them. But everything else has changed. Our delegation's table now sits near the center of the chamber, our flag displayed alongside symbols of species who once considered us beneath their notice. New attaches from Earth arrive regularly now, trained not in the careful, defensive patience my generation had to learn through hard experience, but in a confident, measured diplomacy, built on the foundation we spent those difficult early years establishing. I remember my sister's question from all those years ago, asking why I stayed in a place that treated me the way this council once did. I did not have a good answer for her then, only a vague sense that leaving would mean abandoning something important before it had the chance to become what it was meant to be. I have a better answer for her now, one I finally understand well enough to put into words. I stayed because I believed, even during the hardest years, that patience was not the same as surrender, that watching carefully and waiting for the right moment was its own quiet form of strength, one that would eventually speak louder than any single act of aggression ever could. The galaxy learned that lesson the day a single human warship arrived above a quiet, unremarkable colony and made clear, without a single shot fired, that the species they had spent 3 years underestimating had simply been waiting, patiently and deliberately, for the moment respect could no longer be withheld without consequence. I was there for all of it, from the first casual insult spoken in a crowded chamber to the quiet, steady transformation that followed in its wake, and I understand now, more clearly than I ever could have at the start of this journey, that humanity's silence was never weakness at all. It was simply the sound of a species preparing, patiently and carefully, for the moment the galaxy would finally have to listen.